Evening, and welcome to step 106 in our walking tour of the Bible. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove. Now, we've got to that stage in the first book of the Kings where the author is telling us about, giving us brief summaries really, about the various kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. One of the things we notice as soon as we get to chapter 12 is that Israel is far more unstable than Judah. Judah sticks with the house of David, and one king succeeds another, and that is more or less okay. Whereas in the house in Israel, you have Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who comes to power through a coup. He dies in his bed, he leaves his kingdom to his son. His son is murdered after 2 years by an army officer. This army officer then reigns, Baasha, in Israel and leaves the throne to his son, who is murdered by an army officer. That army officer, a man called Zimri, is then murdered after 1 week. And then another army officer takes over, who's called Omri, and he fights it out with yet another army officer until Omri comes to the throne. And then Omri leaves his throne to his son Ahab. Now, all these kings of Judah are very bad people because they walk in the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. They're all condemned. They're all considered absolutely ghastly. One of the things we draw from this is that the author of the first book of the Kings is writing from the perspective of Judah. Judah gets a much better press than Israel. The Israelites are the separatists. They are bad. Now, you might think all these kings are bad because they're heretics and because they're not doing what they ought to be doing and so on. But and then it comes to the case of Ahab. And Ahab, it turns out, is the worst of all the kings that anybody can ever remember. And we're told, this is chapter 16, verses 29, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned over Israel for 22 years in Samaria. Ahab, son of Omri, did what is displeasing to the Lord, and was worse than all his predecessors. The least that he did was to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Well, that's bad. He married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, a foreigner, a pagan, and then proceeded to serve Baal and worship him. He erected an altar to him in the temple of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Ahab put up a sacred pole and committed other crimes as well, provoking the anger of the Lord God of Israel more than all the other kings of Israel, his predecessors. And then it adds, it was in his time that Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho, laying its foundations cost him his eldest son Abiram, and erecting its gates cost him his youngest son Segub, just as the Lord had foretold to the Joshua son of Nun. In other words, one of the things that happens in the reign of Ahab is child sacrifice. When you're building the foundations of a city or a house, you bury alive your eldest son or your youngest son under the structure you're building to ensure that it stays up. Now, what is so bad about Ahab? Well, it's at this point we need to talk about sin once again. And indeed, in the first book of the Kings, sin is the constant thing. Ahab is bad because he is what we call a syncretist. Now, what does this mean? Well, first of all, he's a religious separatist because he's not worshipping properly at the temple, following the example of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. But it's worse than that. He's not just worshipping God, the Lord, the God of Israel. He is doing that, but he's also placing side bets. He's worshipping Baal, or he is tolerating the worship of Baal. One of the things we can read between the lines is that Ahab built the temple of Baal for his wife, Jezebel, and her father was called Ithbaal, which means the man of Baal. Now, in fact, Jezebel's father was a priest of Baal. Now, who is Baal? Baal is just the Lord. It means the pagan god. You don't want to mention the pagan god's name, but his name, we just call him Baal. It's a generic term for the pagan deity, or one of the pagan deities. Now, Ethbaal was in fact some sort of priest of Astarte, who is is usually identified with with the Roman goddess Venus, Aphrodite in Greek. Anyway, the point about this is, and this is the thing that the author of the book can't stand, is that Ahab is a mix and match sort of person when it comes to religion. He is pick and mix. Yes, he goes along with the Lord, but he also pays attention to Baal and other gods as well. He erects a sacred pole, goodness knows what that was for, and things like that. And he tolerates pagan practices, including child sacrifice. In other words, Ahab is a religious pluralist. Ahab is religiously tolerant. Now, generally speaking, in the modern world, being tolerant and being pluralist is considered quite a good thing. And even possibly in the days of Ahab, it was considered quite a good thing. Because don't forget, Ahab has made an alliance with the Phoenicians, who are far more technologically advanced than the Israelites. We know this because don't forget it was Hiram, king of Tyre, who helped Solomon build a temple. The other thing about Ahab is in some ways he's quite a good king. It says here that he's the worst king possible from the religious point of view. The reason he's the worst king possible from the religious point of view is because in himself he's quite a capable man, as we'll see. He reigns for 22 years after all, which is more than anybody else has managed, I think, in Israel, apart from Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. The other thing is his wife, who is the absolute worst, and that becomes very apparent in what we'll read later, is also highly energetic and capable. So these are the worst sort of heretics you could possibly have, in that they are energetic exponents of the advantages of abandoning the purity of the worship of the one true God, the God of Israel. And so we come to today, because why are we reading this history? Well, so that we'll learn the lessons of the past. Today, there are many voices who will tell us that we've got to get with the modern world, that we've got to accept the insights of the modern world, and we've got to adapt our Christian beliefs and our Catholic beliefs to the modern world to make them more acceptable. In other words, Catholicism has got to move with the times. You've heard this. I've heard this. I've heard it for 30, 40 years. And of course, I'm as implacably opposed to Catholicism moving with the times 40 years ago as I am today. Because moving with the times, if it means watering down the revealed truth, is not acceptable. Because if something is watered down, it becomes less flavoursome, it becomes less attractive, it becomes, in fact, something to be rejected in the end. And also, if you water down the truth, you may add to the truth things that are inimical to truth and which will destroy the truth. Let's say you have some beautiful, sweet fruit juice and you put in some salt, it becomes disgusting. If you put in something that goes against the grain of religion, you destroy religion from within. Now, the real problem with Ahab and with Jezebel, these are the people who admit the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse is Baalism into the religion of Israel. And Baalism will eventually destroy the religion of Israel. And so too, if we let in the Trojan horse that will destroy our faith, then all will be ruined. What is the Trojan horse that will destroy our faith? Well, it's certainly not the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. It's certainly not the philosophy of Heidegger. It's certainly not any of those intellectual movements. It's rather the idea of what I would call the myth of progress, the idea that everything to stay ahead has to change of itself and adapt to the time. In other words, the time is the master rather than the faith itself. It's the Whig theory of history, the idea that religion is useful but not necessarily true. Religion could be useful, it may be useful, it has been useful, but that's not really why we believe in religion, because it's useful. The faith claims allegiance because it is true. Essentially, what we're fighting is what all devout Catholics have always fought, and that is the fundamental heresy that was identified by Cardinal Newman, which was that the truths of religion are only relatively true rather than absolutely true. They can be molded, they are subjective, they're not objective. And it is the truths of the world that trump the truths of religion. I'm sure that Ahab and Jezebel must have had long conversations between themselves and amongst their friends, saying, it's time for the religion of the Lord God of Israel to move on. We've got to keep up with the times. We've got to realize that people want human sacrifice. It's something they need. Or their feelings are very, very pro human sacrifice. They don't feel at home unless they've, done a human sacrifice when their family is sick, and things like that. Baal is the way forward, they would have said. You've got to understand the religion of Baal is far more appealing to our people than the religion of the Lord you can't see, Baal you can see. Okay, so I've gone on long enough, but that is essentially what syncretism is. Syncretism is the idea that religion constantly, the faith, constantly needs injections of contemporary wisdom to stay alive. Imagine some sort of person who constantly needs blood infusions to stay alive. Well, there are such people, unfortunately. But religion, the faith, has within it all it needs. It doesn't rely on transfusions or from the outside when these are inimical to what is already in religion. Hope I've explained it, but we'll see again and again, as we'll see when we get on to Ahab and Jezebel, who are the most interesting characters, by the way, in the whole Bible. All the best. Bye bye.